Kieran Nallus was no stranger to authority. As a decorated general of the Axanthan military, he had spent years navigating the complex web of imperial politics. But even the most cunning soldier had limits. The Empress, however, had none. Summoned to the towering obsidian palace at the heart of Axanthe Prime, Kieran stood alone in the cavernous throne room. It was a place designed to dwarf even the proudest of warriors. Monolithic columns stretched skyward, lined with the pulsating green veins of the planet's rarest energy crystals. The air itself seemed heavier here, as if the weight of the Empress's power pressed on everyone who entered. She descended from her throne slowly, each step deliberate. Her gown shimmered, a blend of metallic fabrics that refracted the light into a shifting aurora. Behind her flowed the long, translucent train, etched with ancient glyphs that glowed faintly, giving her the appearance of some otherworldly deity. But Kieran saw only a woman who had traded her humanity for dominion. "Kneel," she commanded. Her voice was neither loud nor soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Even the guards flanking her stiffened at the sound. "Bow before me and pledge your undying loyalty, Kieran Nallus. Do so, and you may keep your rank, your wealth, and most precious of all your family." Kieran, dressed in the simple black uniform of the Axanthan elite, stood motionless. His jaw was clenched, his gray eyes fixed on the Empress's violet gaze. A moment passed, then another. Her smile faded. "Defiance," she said, her tone tinged with disappointment. "I've allowed you this once, because of your service, your victories. But this is your final chance. Kneel." He drew a slow breath, letting it fill the silence. "I swore an oath," he said, his voice steady. "An oath to protect the Axanthan people, not to become an enforcer of your tyranny." Her face remained expressionless, but the faintest flicker of amusement danced in her eyes. "A man of principle," she mused. "How quaint. Do you think your refusal will change anything? Do you believe your defiance is noble?" "I believe," he said, "that someone must draw the line." Her amusement evaporated. With a barely perceptible wave of her hand, the guard stepped forward. Two grabbed Kieran's arms, their grips as firm as iron. He didn't resist. A third soldier approached, carrying a portable holoscreen. With a tap, it illuminated, displaying a live feed from his own home. In the image, his daughter Elara was sitting at the kitchen table, her dark hair falling in messy waves as she worked on a holographic puzzle. She was the spitting image of her late mother, with the same warm brown skin and thoughtful gaze. Kieran's blood turned to ice. "You see," the Empress said, stepping closer, "I don't need you to kneel today. I can wait. I have all the time in the universe. But I think you'll find that time is something your daughter may not have if you continue this charade." His voice caught in his throat. "Leave her out of this." The Empress tilted her head, as if considering his plea. "I would prefer not to harm her. Truly. But the future of my empire depends on unity. On obedience. And you, General, are the highest profile example. If you refuse me, what message does that send?" She gestured to the holoscreen. The camera feed shifted to show the outside of his home, where a squad of Imperial enforcers was waiting. They wore the jet-black armor of the Empress's personal guard, their visors reflecting the faint green glow of the city skyline. Behind them, a transport vehicle hovered, ready to depart. "You can end this now," the Empress said. "Swear your allegiance, and I'll call them off. Your daughter will remain safe, and you will return to my service with honor restored. Think of her, Kieran. Do you want her to suffer because of your stubbornness?" Kieran struggled to keep his expression calm, but his heart pounded. Elara was all he had left. If they took her, there was no telling what would happen. The slave camps were no place for a child. But if he bowed now, he would lose himself, his dignity, his soul. He drew himself up, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You can threaten me. You can take my rank, my home, my family. But I will not kneel." The words hung in the air. The Empress regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a faint sigh, she turned to her guards. Take the girl. No. Kieran's voice rose, but the soldiers held him firm. He strained against their grasp, his muscles screaming, but he couldn't break free. The holoscreen showed the enforcers entering his home. Elara's cries echoed through the room, each one a dagger to his heart. They dragged her out, her arms flailing, her voice pleading for her father. And then the screen went dark. The Empress smiled again, faint but cold. You'll come to understand, in time. Everyone kneels eventually. She turned and ascended the stairs back to her throne. Throw him out. Let him stew in his failure. The guards released him roughly, and Kieran fell to his knees not in submission, but in agony. The last thing he saw as they dragged him from the throne room was the Empress's distant silhouette, perched on her seat of power, her will unshaken. But deep inside, Kieran's own will burned brighter than ever. She had taken everything, and in doing so, she had made a fatal error. Kieran would not bow. And one day, he would make her regret it. The transport ship hurtled through the darkness of space, its engines a low, relentless hum. Kieran sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, surrounded by other prisoners, criminals, rebels, and those who had simply crossed the wrong people. They were a grim, hollow-eyed bunch, each bearing their own scars from the Empire's cruelty. Kieran didn't speak, didn't meet their eyes. He was a man with a singular purpose, and his mind remained focused on it. He was going to find Elara. The Empress's guards hadn't even bothered to interrogate him before tossing him onto this transport. They must have assumed he would rot in a cell, broken and shamed. But Kieran had already made his choice. He would follow the path she had laid out, not out of submission, but out of strategy. Let them think they had won. Let them think he was defeated. The journey took hours. Kieran used the time to observe his surroundings. The transport's interior was cold and featureless, lined with hard, angular panels of reinforced alloy. A single security droid hovered at the front of the cabin, its red sensor light sweeping over the prisoners every few minutes. The guards were stationed in an enclosed cockpit, no doubt monitoring them through hidden cameras and ready to deploy automated defenses at the slightest sign of rebellion. Finally, the ship shuddered as it began its descent. Kieran stared out the narrow viewport. The moon of Sarnis loomed below, a desolate wasteland of rocky plains and jagged cliffs. Its surface was mottled with dark scars where mining operations had torn through the crust. In the distance, Kieran could make out the faint glint of the camp's perimeter, electrified fences, tall watchtowers, and blocky barracks that seemed to huddle against the hostile landscape. As the ship touched down, the prisoners were herded out by armed enforcers. The daylight on Sarnis 4 was dim and gray, filtered through a thin, dusty atmosphere that seemed to leach the color from everything. The cold bit at Kieran's skin. He looked around at the other prisoners, some huddled together, others staring at the ground and resolved to remember each face. Allies would be hard to come by in a place like this. The camp itself was larger than he had expected, sprawling across the barren terrain like a festering wound. High walls, topped with shimmering energy barriers, surrounded the compound. Guard towers were spaced at regular intervals, their spotlights sweeping the grounds. Drones buzzed overhead, their angular frames bristling with sensors and weaponry. It was a prison designed not just to contain, but to break the spirit. After a brief intake process, little more than a cursory check for weapons or contraband, Kieran was assigned a serial number and shoved into the general population. There were no cells, only shared barracks. Inside the long, low building, rows of metal bunks lined the walls. The air smelled of sweat and dampness. Prisoners sat or lay on their cots, speaking in hushed tones or simply staring into space. Kieran's arrival drew little attention. A few glanced up, their eyes lingering on him for a moment before returning to their own thoughts. He moved to an empty cot and sat down, his back straight, his expression calm. He knew better than to let the camp's oppressive atmosphere seep into his soul. But beneath his calm exterior, he was already assessing his situation. He needed to learn the camp's layout, its routines, and its weaknesses. More importantly, he needed to find Elara. His first step would be to gain information quietly, carefully. Over the next several days, Kieran worked to blend in. He labored in the mines, kept his head down, and listened. He learned that the camp's prisoners were divided into tiers, with the lowest tier reserved for the weakest and youngest. Elara was likely there, under the harshest conditions, forced to endure long shifts in the toxic lower mines. Kieran also noticed that the guards relied heavily on their technology to maintain control. Neural dampeners, worn like collars, suppressed any impulses to resist or flee. The security drones monitored every inch of the camp, and the guards themselves rarely interacted with the prisoners directly. It was a system designed to dehumanize, to reduce the prisoners to mere numbers in a machine. But no system was perfect. In the dim light of the barracks one night, Kieran struck up a conversation with a fellow prisoner, a wiry man named Eric. Eric claimed to have been a resistance fighter before his capture. Over several whispered exchanges, Kieran pieced together a rough mental map of the camp. Eric also confirmed Kieran's suspicion. Children were kept in the lower levels, where the work was dangerous and the air barely breathable. "It's hell down there," Eric said, his voice low and bitter. "If you've got someone down there, you'd better act fast. Most don't last long." Kieran nodded grimly. "Then I'll act fast." The days passed in a blur of toil and observation. Kieran worked tirelessly, but his mind never stopped analyzing. He noted guard rotations, security drone patterns, and the timing of supply deliveries. He began to form a plan not just to reach Elara, but to do so without triggering alarms or endangering her further. He knew the Empress would expect him to fail, to languish in despair. But that expectation was her mistake. Kieran wasn't just a soldier. He was a strategist. And he had already begun turning the Empress's own system against her. As the cold nights on Sarnis 4 stretched on, Kieran's determination hardened into something unbreakable. He would find Elara. He would free her. And he would make the Empress regret underestimating him. The air in the lower mines was acrid and thin, choked with dust and the tang of sulfur. The dim glow of phosphorescent minerals embedded in the rock provided the only light, casting flickering shadows along the damp walls. It was here, in these suffocating depths, that Kieran Nallis had to search for his daughter and where survival depended on equal measures of cunning and restraint. As Kieran descended into the heart of the mining operation, he passed through a checkpoint manned by security drones. Their hollow red optics swept over each prisoner, scanning for contraband or signs of rebellion. Kieran kept his eyes low, his face blank. It had taken weeks of careful maneuvering to reach this tier. He'd gained the trust of certain prisoners, slipped a minor tool repair accident into the rotation schedule, and found a way to volunteer for the lower mines. Officially, he was here because of his experience working in hazardous conditions. Unofficially, he'd worked his way down one calculated step at a time. The guards and overseers rarely showed their faces down here. They left the drones to enforce discipline. But that only made the lower mines more dangerous. If something went wrong, there was no one to hear the screams, no one to call for help. Kieran took note of every detail, the frequency of the drones' patrols, the range of their scanners, the weak points in their routes. He was always watching, always learning. In the thin ranks of prisoners here, children were scattered among the workers. Some labored side by side with adults, their small frames better suited to crawling through narrow shafts. Others were assigned to sorting stations where they sifted through rubble for valuable minerals. Each of them wore a collar fitted with neural dampeners, the cold metal resting heavily on their young shoulders. Kieran's stomach turned every time he saw a child stumble under a load that was far too heavy or cough violently from the toxic air. His hands itched to act, but he knew he couldn't rush. One reckless move would trigger an alarm, and then it would all be over. He needed to find Elara first. Over the next few shifts, Kieran quietly asked questions. He traded small favors help with a heavy load, a portion of his ration pack for scraps of information. "There's a girl," he heard from a gaunt prisoner named Lyra. "Short, dark hair, about 12 or so. She's been working near Shaft Delta 7. Kieran felt a jolt of hope. Delta 7 was just one shaft over. He worked his way into that rotation, volunteering to assist with a transfer of war carts. It brought him closer to the sorting station where the younger prisoners worked. As he maneuvered one of the bulky carts into position, he saw her. Elara. She was smaller than he remembered, her frame thinner, her face streaked with grime. Her hair was tangled, her hands red and raw from constant work. But her eyes, those were still hers, sharp and alert, despite everything. She was sorting through a pile of crushed stone, her movements methodical and quick. Kieran's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, all the horrors of the camp faded, and he saw only his daughter. She was alive. Kieran couldn't approach her directly. He had to stay in the background, watching and planning. He noted when she started her shifts and when she finished, who was stationed nearby, and which drones passed by most frequently. Every piece of information was another step toward getting her out. But Elara wasn't the only one suffering in the lower mines. The other children, the other prisoners, they were all trapped in this unrelenting cycle of toil. Kieran knew he could rescue her quietly, slip away in the chaos of a well-timed distraction. But as he saw the hopeless faces around him, a more dangerous idea began to form. What if he didn't just rescue Elara? What if he brought the whole system crashing down? In whispers, he approached certain prisoners, those who still had fire in their eyes, those who carried themselves like former soldiers or resistance members. He spoke to them carefully, testing their resolve. Not all responded, but a handful listened. He found allies in unexpected places, a quiet engineer who understood how the dampeners worked, a miner with a knack for rigging explosives, and a former officer who still remembered how to command. Together, they began to lay the groundwork. They mapped out the dampener control stations and the locations of key security hubs. They identified weak points in the drone's patrols and studied the patterns of war shipments. Each discovery brought them closer to a plan that seemed impossible but grew more tangible every day. It wouldn't happen overnight. The guards were brutal, the drones relentless. One mistake could doom them all. But in the dark corners of the lower mines, hope began to flicker. Kieran's name started to be whispered among the prisoners, not as the broken man who had arrived weeks before, but as someone who was quietly building a way out. Not just for himself, not just for his daughter, but for all of them. Kieran knew the risks. If the Empress ever learned of his plans, her wrath would be unimaginable. But she had made a fatal error in thinking that casting him into the pit would break him. Instead, it had only given him the shadows in which to sharpen his resolve. In the heart of Sarni's IV's mining colony, change began as a whisper. Through dark tunnels and overcrowded barracks, prisoners passed secret messages, a nod, a glance, a scrap of paper hidden beneath a rock. The guards had no inkling, and the drones remained oblivious. The prisoners had learned long ago how to speak without words, how to act without being seen. Kieran moved carefully, circulating through the lower mines where children worked and the barracks where battle-scarred veterans slept. He kept his voice low and his instructions simple. The plan was ambitious, even reckless, but every prisoner who listened to him felt a spark reignite. Hope, crushed so many times before, flickered back to life. On a night when the pale moonlight barely reached the mine's surface, the rebellion began. The neural dampeners were the first target. A team of prisoners, led by the wiry engineer Kieran, had recruited, infiltrated the central control hub. It was a risky mission. Drones hovered outside the station, and the slightest misstep could trigger alarms. But the engineer worked quickly, her hand steady as she patched into the control panel circuits. When the dampeners went offline, the effect rippled instantly through the camp. Kieran felt it first as a subtle shift in the air. The oppressive weight in his mind, that constant, numbing presence, suddenly lifted. He flexed his fingers, and for the first time in weeks, he felt fully in control of his thoughts. Around him, the other prisoners straightened their backs. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to low cheers. The dampeners were down. The guards noticed the change too late. By the time they mobilized, the prisoners had already seized the supply depot. Crates of stolen tools became weapons. Cargo drones, hacked by the same engineer, turned their energy welders against the enforcers. A team of former soldiers stormed the central armory, overpowering the few guards stationed there and distributing blasters to those who knew how to use them. Kieran himself led the charge into the lower mines. He carried a makeshift baton, a metal rod he had sharpened into a crude blade, and fought like a man with everything to lose. The guards were poorly trained, complacent from years of unquestioned dominance. Kieran's military instincts took over. He directed his makeshift army with sharp commands, flanking the guards and driving them back into retreat. Amid the chaos, Kieran found Alara. She had been trapped in one of the deepest shafts, assigned to a shift just before the rebellion began. When he reached her, she was huddled with a few other children, their faces streaked with grime and fear. Kieran dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. She clung to him tightly, her small frame trembling against his chest. "Papa," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I thought you'd never find me." "I'm here now," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'm not letting go." They had no time to rest. The guards regrouped near the main gate, trying to call for reinforcements. Kieran gave Alara to one of his trusted allies and ordered them to lead the children to safety. Then he turned his attention to the camp's final stronghold, the control tower. It loomed above the compound, a black spire bristling with antennae and sensors. Inside, the overseers were desperately trying to re-establish control. Kieran and a small team stormed the entrance, fighting their way through the last line of guards. The halls echoed with the sound of blaster fire and shouted commands. Kieran's every move was calculated, his every strike precise. He was no longer just a man, he was a force of nature. At the top of the tower, Kieran confronted the overseer. The man was pale, sweating, his uniform disheveled. He held a blaster in trembling hands, but Kieran didn't flinch. He walked forward slowly, his blade gleaming in the dim light. "Please," the overseer stammered. We can negotiate." Kieran didn't answer. He didn't need to. With a single motion, he disarmed the man and forced him to his knees. The overseer's pleas turned into a choked silence as Kieran stood over him, his gaze cold. "This isn't about you," Kieran said, his voice low. "It's about all the lives you've destroyed. The children you've condemned. The families you've torn apart. You're just a cog in a machine, but you had a choice. And you chose to serve her." The overseer didn't reply. He knew his fate was sealed. Kieran turned away, leaving the man where he knelt. Instead of killing him, Kieran issued a broadcast from the tower's communications array. The message was simple: the slaves of Sarnis IV had risen. The camp's overseer was captured. The guards were defeated. The prisoners were free. The broadcast sent shockwaves through the galaxy. In other camps, prisoners who had lost all hope now saw a glimmer of light. Word spread of a general who had defied the Empress, who had descended into hell itself to save his daughter and ignite a rebellion. Kieran's name became a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance. As the camp's prisoners filed out into the open air, their faces weary but triumphant, Kieran stood with Alara at his side. The battle wasn't over. The Empress would respond with fury, and Kieran knew their fight was only beginning. But in this moment, they had won. For the first time in years, the prisoners of Sarnis IV looked up at the stars and felt a flicker of freedom. Kieran squeezed Alara's hand and looked at the horizon. He hadn't just saved his daughter. He had sparked a rebellion that would one day bring the Empress herself to her knees.